This screencast covers thyroid-stimulating hormone and thyroid hormones. The objectives of the screencast are as follows. We're going to start by describing the four tropic hormones that are released by the anterior pituitary gland in general, and then we're going to specifically focus on thyroid-stimulating hormone. Thyroid-stimulating hormone, as its name implies, targets the thyroid gland, causing it to release thyroid hormones. And so we'll describe those hormones as well. And then we'll wrap up by explaining what causes the development of a goiter. We're going back to this image, which shows the 6 hormones that are released from the anterior pituitary gland, all in response to hormones from the hypothalamus. We already discussed growth hormone and prolactin. We're now going to focus on the remaining 4, and all of these hormones are tropic hormones. That means they target other endocrine organs, causing the growth and proliferation of the endocrine tissues of those organs, and ultimately they stimulate the release of hormones from those organs. Those 4 tropic hormones are thyroid-stimulating hormone, which, as its name implies, targets the thyroid gland; follicle-stimulating hormone, which targets the ovaries and testes; luteinizing hormone, which also targets the ovaries and testes; and follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone collectively are referred to as the Gonadotropins because they both target the gonads. And lastly, adrenocorticotropic hormone, which targets the adrenal cortex. We will start with thyrotropic hormone, which targets the thyroid gland. And just to be clear, thyrotropic hormone and thyroid-stimulating hormone are the same. It's just 2 different names for the same hormone. First, you may be unfamiliar with the thyroid gland, so let's talk a little bit about this organ. The thyroid gland is found in the base of the throat. It's just underneath your voice box, or your larynx rather, which contains your voice box. This is a blow-up image of the thyroid gland in the neck. So if you find your larynx, and all you have to do is find this thyroid cartilage here. This is what makes up the superficial portion of your Adam's apple. And so just find your Adam's apple and just go right below it, and you hit the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland sort of reminds me of Madison. You have the east side, you have the west side, and then you have a little isthmus. That would be the downtown area that connects the 2 sides. The thyroid gland produces 2 hormones, or rather 2 types of hormones. It produces this hormone called calcitonin, which we'll talk about in another screencast, and it produces 2 other hormones, which we typically refer to as just the thyroid hormones, which is T3 and T4, triiodothyronine and tetraiodothyronine. So again, the thyroid gland produces 3 hormones, but we only refer, when you hear the term thyroid hormones, it refers to T3 and T4, even though technically calcitonin is produced by the thyroid gland. Calcitonin is unaffected by thyroid-stimulating hormone, so we're just going to focus on T3 and T4. Thyroid-stimulating hormone is released from the anterior pituitary gland in response to thyroid-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. Thyroid-stimulating hormone targets the thyroid gland, causing an increase in growth of the thyroid gland as well as secretion of thyroid hormones. Thyroid hormones, once released into the blood, pretty much target every cell of the body. And when it interacts with the receptors of its target cells, it increases the production and utilization of ATP. And in that way, it increases the basal metabolic rate of the body in general. I thought I'd take a moment to share with you the chemistry of the thyroid hormones. You have thyroxine, also known as T4, and most thyroid hormone actually is T4. That's actually what's produced by the thyroid gland. T4, when it interacts with its target cells, is actually converted to T3. But I won't get into the details of that. But T3 and T4 are so abbreviated because they contain 4 and 3 atoms of iodine per molecule. So the thyroid hormones are modified amino acids. They're modified from the amino acid tyrosine. Thyroxine has 4 iodine atoms per molecule, and triiodothyronine has 3. In fact, the human body has a nutritional requirement for iodine, mainly, if not exclusively, because it is a component of these thyroid hormones. The thyroid hormones are non-steroidal, of course, if they're modifications of amino acids, but remember, they do not bind receptors on the plasma membrane and work through second messengers because there are specific channels which allow them to enter the cell, bind receptors inside the cell, and then have a direct effect on the DNA. Remember, this is the one exception to the chemistry rule where steroids bind directly to the DNA and non-steroidal hormones work through second messengers. Even though this is a non-steroidal hormone, it binds directly to the DNA and it exerts its effects on its target cells. Hypothyroidism is a condition where the thyroid gland secretes below normal levels of thyroid hormone. This can be caused by an iodine deficiency, and that is because iodine is a component of thyroid hormone. So if you're not taking in sufficient amounts of iodine, your thyroid gland is not going to be able to make normal amounts of thyroid hormone. Now, this does not so much happen today, but there was a time where people out in the west part of the United States grew crops in soils that did not have a lot of iodine in them, and so there wasn't a lot of iodine in the food that they consumed, unlike today where we can ship food all over the country, even internationally. Most of what people consumed was locally grown, and so people would develop iodine deficiencies. And one of the symptoms of an iodine deficiency would be an enlarged thyroid, or what is called a goiter. Here you can see a rather large goiter here on the left, and this is 15 days after removal of that goiter. Now today, people don't typically, in the United States anyway, get iodine deficiency. The food that you eat comes from all over the place. And so you're less likely to have a deficiency of any nutrient based on local growing conditions or soil nutrients. And also, potassium iodate is supplemented in most commercially provided salts. So typically, there's plenty of iodine in the diet. There's not a lot of iodine that's required to meet the requirements of the human body, but a little is required. Let's look now at the regulation of thyroid hormones, because it will explain why a iodine deficiency causes enlargement of the thyroid. So the hypothalamus, as you know, produces thyroid releasing hormone, which causes the anti-pituitary gland to produce thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone literally stimulates the thyroid to increase its production of T3 and T4. As T3 and T4 levels in the blood rise, they inhibit further release of thyroid stimulating hormone, and they also inhibit further release of thyroid releasing hormone by the hypothalamus. Classic negative feedback. So let's look at what happens if an individual is deficient in iodine. Even in the presence of thyroid stimulating hormone, the thyroid gland can't produce more T3 and T4 because it doesn't have the iodine to do it. So essentially, the T3 and T4 levels are suppressed. That is, they don't rise to the normal levels. And so you don't have your normal feedback onto the anti-pituitary gland or the hypothalamus. So this causes continuous secretion of thyroid releasing hormone and continuous secretion of thyroid stimulating hormone, which causes the thyroid gland to enlarge and for the cells of the thyroid gland to reproduce in an attempt to produce and release more T3 and T4. But because of the insufficient iodine, it can't do that. So it just simply gets larger and larger. And that is why an iodine deficiency causes a goiter. Before ending, let's review the learning objectives of the screencast. Describe the tropic hormones released by the anti-pituitary gland. Specifically, describe thyroid stimulating hormone. Describe then the hormones released from the thyroid gland, T3 and T4, and explain what causes the development of a goiter. Remember that for each hormone, you must know the following: the organ and tissue of release, the location of that organ, its target organ and tissue, stimulation of secretion, its effects, its chemistry and mechanism of action, and its regulation of secretion. So make sure you fill out your hormones and properties table for thyroid hormones, T3 and T4.